Welcome everybody to this webinar on a rather large report which the wiiw completed some months ago called A New Growth Model in EU-CEEs, Avoiding the Specialization Trap and Embracing Megatrends. There will be a short presentation of this report and by Richard Grieveson, and followed by a discussion of a rather distinguished set of panelists. The report was commissioned by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and I'm very happy to introduce Ernst Hillebrand, who will say a few words of introduction about the context in which this report was written. Ernst Hillebrand is director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's office in Warsaw, and was previously the head of the International Political Analysis Department of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. I think, Ernst, you might want to say a bit more about the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and how you came to commissioning this report.
Many thanks, Michael, for this nice introduction. But indeed, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has been commissioning this study with the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And I would just want to say some words about the background, why we did this. I mean, some of you might know the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We are a political party foundation. We are funded by the means of the funds of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's public money that we're using. And we are working with our partners in Central Eastern Europe, but also in a lot of other countries on Earth in trying to find or support them in formulating solutions for the problems of their societies, to do is in a European spirit and a spirit of cooperation and mutual understanding between our countries. And doing this work in Central Eastern Europe, we had increasingly the impression that perhaps in the debate that our partners in the trade union movement and civil society movements, but also in the political movements, are formulating that there has been a certain lack of economic dimension. And this has been a little bit neglected. We, on the other side, as an organization that is close to the German trade union movement and to the German social democracy, we are, of course, quite influenced by a kind of economistic thinking, which has always been typical for German social democracy and German industrial trade unions. Questions of economic and financial policy and of technological policy have always been taken comparatively serious by these movements. So when we started to discuss the study, we had the impression that we were seeing something as an emerging problem, which consisted in the fact that the dominant gross model in Central Eastern Europe, as we have seen it evolve over the last 3 decades, the one of dependent market capitalism, as Andreas Nölke has labeled it, despite all its successes, was coming up against some kind of glass ceiling when it comes to economic and social progress, but also that it was starting to face a series of new challenges that even threatened to erode the very foundations of this cross models. I mean, most of these developments and trends are marvelously described in the study, so we just named some of them: digitalization, other forms of technological change like additive manufacturing in the manufacturing industries, and especially, of course, the challenge of CO2 reduction, which is particularly challenging for Central Eastern Europe because of its high dependency on coal as a primary energy source. Then we have, of course, a rapid demographic change, a shrinking population, incipient labor shortages, something very new for the region. We have a fundamental technological change in the automotive sector, which is so important in Central Eastern Europe. And of course, we have an ongoing challenge from production sites in Asia that will not disappear only because globalization might be a little hiccup in the next 2 years or some years. So that's why we commissioned the study at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Analysis, and we are extremely happy with the result. It has served us from the very point of publication as a good basis for debate with our partners, civil society and trade union, but also with political partners about where the economic journey of Central Eastern Europe should go in the next years. But this is, of course, and I want to finish with that, not only a question of importance for Central Eastern Europe in itself, it's also a question that is important for Austria and Germany. Central Eastern Europe is by far the most important trading partner in the world. And so the question whether we will be able to maintain high levels of growth in this part of Europe, also with the aim to compensate for the very low levels of growth that we are witnessing in other parts of Europe, especially in Southern Europe and Western Europe, parts of the Eurozone, is also of great importance for Germany and the German industry and the German economy. So that's why we have a mutual interest, I think, in Central Eastern Europe, with our partners, but also in Germany, to get this question right and to get a better understanding of what could be the way forward to find a new quality growth model for this region that is so important for Germany, but also for Austria. So that's the background why we have asked for this study, and we are, let me repeat this, extremely happy with the result. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ernst Hillebrand, for your introduction. So before I introduce the panelists, on the time structure of what we do in this webinar, Richard Grieveson, the Deputy Director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, will give about 15 plus little bit presentation of the main contents of the report and the possible policy conclusions one can draw from it. And we will then get reactions by the three panelists who you see hopefully on the screen. I start with Maruska Vizek, who has been for quite some time director of the Institute for Economics in Zagreb, now assistant director of the institute, I guess heavily involved in organizing research there. She's a distinguished macroeconomist, does a lot of applied economic work in the area of international economics. And the institute itself is one of the important research institutes in economic research in Central Eastern Europe. Jan Hagemejer is Vice President of CASE, the Center for Social and Economic Research in Poland, an equally highly decorated think tank in Central and Eastern Europe. He was, prior to his current position in CASE, he was at the National Bank of Poland, heading the division of structural analysis. And his research is particularly in an area of international trade, on global value chains, also micro research on productivity, firm analysis, etc. And Debora Revoltella, who just reappeared on our screen, is Chief Economist and Director of the Economic Research Department of the European Investment Bank. A very busy person, having to produce a very substantial EIB investment report every year. And I think in that sense, very suitable for this webinar, because she and her colleague also work very strongly on the new growth models and might take a slightly different, we'll see what slant she takes on that, the new growth model in Central Eastern Europe. So I think they are occupied with similar concerns. And before that, she was chief economist of UniCredit, chief economist for Central Eastern Europe, having had a stint in Vienna for some years in this situation. And finally, we have Richard Grieveson, who I already introduced earlier, our deputy director of the Vienna Institute. He was coordinating the study and is very familiar with developments in Central Eastern, also in the Balkan region. Before that, he was at the Economist Intelligence Unit and at Fitch Ratings Agency in the Emerging Europe team before that. So I think I pass this on now to Richard, who will load his PowerPoint presentation. After that, we will have reactions by the panelists to the main contents of the report. Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for this very nice introduction. Hello, everybody from my side. It's nice to see so many people here. I am as Michael said, the Deputy Director of Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. I coordinated and wrote some of this report, but by no means all of it. And I am presenting on behalf of a pretty big project team today, actually. So I wanted to mention that at the start. This is lots of people's work. It's my pleasure, it's my honor to present it on behalf of them. I should talk for about 15 minutes, I think, certainly no more than 20 minutes. This is actually I think the 7th or the 8th time now I've presented this study. I was always presenting it before in the region. So actually, I think 3 times now in Poland, in Hungary, Czechia, Slovakia, Romania. It's been very, very interesting to do a kind of roadshow around the region and hear what people on the ground think about it. But I'm also very interested now to hear what our very distinguished international panel today think about these issues, our study, but the issues in general, and also to see what the audience thinks about it. So I will speak, but as I said, I've presented this quite a few times already, and I'm really very interested in hearing what you all have to say. So let me just move it on. I'll do 5 things basically in this presentation. I will say a little bit about what we wanted to do, the aims of the research. Ernst already talked about that, but some of the assumptions, let's say, that we started out with. Then I will talk about the endogenous challenges to the growth model as we see them. Then the exogenous challenges, so these so-called megatrends to the growth model. Then I will try to bring the whole thing together on one slide in the SWOT analysis. And then finally, I'll talk about policy proposals. So coming out of this, as we see them, what are the priorities for policymakers? So how we started out, I mean, the assumptions that we had or what we wanted to do, the areas for investigation. The first one, so the hypothesis is the model's hitting the limits. The growth model is hitting the limits, and the functional specialization patterns that we see can suggest something of a trap. That's the first part. I'll say more in a minute what I mean by that. The second part is that new exogenous challenges, so, well, demographics, not especially new one, environmental challenges, technological challenges are in a way a second transition for Central and Eastern Europe, coming after the first transition of the 90s. And there are opportunities in this, so it's not a completely sort of negative story full of threats, but there are also some serious risks in this, and policy has to react. And then the third thing which we have, and this is in the introduction to the study, is that we want to take something from the literature on the ideas of national champions in the entrepreneurial state. We want to take this part of the literature very seriously, but we acknowledge that there are drawbacks from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe. We cannot apply these things simply as they are in Central and Eastern Europe, and that's partly because of the constraints of EU membership, maybe more importantly because of institutional factors, institutional weakness in at least some countries of the region. And so we need solutions specific to this region. I guess in the end, that's a lot of what we'll talk about in the debate today. So starting with the endogenous challenges. So in a very broad sense, very big picture point to start with, integration of the global value chains, the dominant economic model of this region, has driven strong convergence, especially compared to a lot of Southern Europe. So we show comparison with Spain on the left, but even relative to Germany. I mean, nobody's quoted Germany, obviously, but certainly convergence relative to Germany. But for the most developed countries of the region, at least, it seems to be hitting a limit. The convergence since the global financial crisis of 2008 has slowed down, and that suggests some endogenous challenges from within the growth model. Now, a big part of the study was then to look at why is that happening, what's going on in the functional specialization patterns. And what we find here when we break it down and we think about the so-called smile curve, the value chain going from headquarters right to business services, is a very strong specialization, relative specialization for Central and Eastern European countries in the production part, so right in the middle of the value chain, and much less at the beginning and end. The problem with this is that all of the value is created really at the beginning and the end, much less in the middle, as I'm sure everybody here is aware of. What we find, and here I show an example of Slovakia and Germany, but I could show this for Croatia and France, so it doesn't really matter which Central and Eastern European country you show here, which Western European country, it looks pretty much the same. Big bar in the middle for Central and Eastern Europe, so in production, much bigger bars on at the beginning and end for Western Europe, so in the higher value activities. And when we look at this over time, it's not really changing. In fact, for the Visegrad countries, for example, it's even intensifying. The relative production specialization is even increasing. And this is where we get to this idea that this is possibly representative of a trap. So a model that served the region well for a certain amount of time, but it should be adapting now, and it's not. And what this chart shows, it's the same information, but just focusing purely on production on the y-axis and then economic development on the x-axis. And you can see with the rings, so the red and the orange rings for most of the countries of this region, considering their level of economic development, they are very much over-specialized in production in a relative sense. And considering the level of economic development, this all else being equal, this relative specialization in production should have decreased by now. So that was the endogenous part. The exogenous challenges then that we build on top of this, I would mention here 5 basically, and I can only mention them very briefly. There's much more in the report if you're interested. The first is changing FDI patterns. So we find in the study, FDI is quite unlikely to be the growth driver that it has been in the past. It has been hugely important for this region, obviously. In some countries of the region, in the business economy, that's the chart here, more or less half of value added is accounted for by foreign firms. Now, it's not going to disappear overnight. There are also going to be opportunities, we think, in this nearshoring. It's a separate study that we did. But FDI, it's changing. It's not going to drive growth in the same way that it has in the past for a lot of the region. The second exogenous challenge is what's happening in the automotive industry, where we have this structural change underway, whether that's because of regulation, whether that's because of consumer preferences, it's changing. And what we find in the study is Central and Eastern Europe, and especially the Visegrad countries, Slovenia and Romania, have a great and even still growing dependence on the automotive industry for overall exports, for overall economic development. And we don't see enough evidence, there's a bit, but we definitely don't see enough evidence of a transition in this sense towards electric vehicles or other parts, other things within this sector, which are likely to be growth industries in the future. There's still too much reliance on this old-fashioned car production, at least in these 6 countries. The third exogenous challenge is then the green transition. It's obviously a very big topic. Again, it's very difficult to summarize on one slide. And here there are 2 messages. The first message is, in terms of rate of change, in terms of growth, the picture is not too bad, actually. So whether it's the carbon intensity of production, that's the chart on the left, whether it's energy efficiency on the right, we do actually see pretty positive developments in Central and Eastern Europe, and pretty consistent as well, spread over years, with maybe just a blip after the 2008 crisis. The problem, so the second message though, is the level. So if you think about levels in this sense, the region is still a long way behind the front runners in Western Europe. And this green transition, this change, it's coming, it's intensifying, and the starting point for the region, even allowing for the quite positive developments of the last 2 decades, is not too positive. And it's going to be a serious challenge now in the next decade, especially if you think about where the region sits in relation to a lot of Western Europe. The fourth exogenous challenge is the digital revolution. This has been obviously intensified massively by the pandemic, probably the thing among all the issues here that's been changed most by the pandemic. And here we see a pretty mixed picture, definitely not uniformly negative for the region. So we see both in terms of industrial change and the adoption of advanced digital production technologies in industry, that's the chart on the left, not a uniformly bad picture in the region. Okay, nobody's comparable with Finland or the real front runners, but relative to the EU average, some countries don't look too bad. And then in terms of the population and how well prepared they are for this, population as a whole, level of digital skills is not great, but for younger people, at least in some countries, the starting point is actually quite decent compared to the EU average. And we see, I mean, we all know this, those of us who spend time or live in the region, I mean, the IT hubs in the region are there. I mean, there is a lot of things going on in the digital economy in the region. So it's not uniformly bad, but this is also certainly an exogenous challenge to the growth model. The final challenge, and this is a very old one, but a very important one, is the demographics. This region has been for a while undergoing the biggest demographic decline in the working age population that's really ever been recorded in peacetime. Before the pandemic, we had a study. This was done by our scientific director, Robert Stehr, and we updated it as part of this study based on current demographic trends, based on growth rates, economic growth rates. When will economies run out of workers? Before COVID, it's the gray bars on this chart, we thought that was more or less imminent in a lot of countries. And we saw that as well with the labor shortages before the pandemic. Calculated for the impact of COVID, that pushes the date back a bit because of the drop in economic activity, reduction in labor demand. But I think if we were to do this again now, at the end of 2021, I think these orange bars would reduce again a bit. And we certainly see, certainly anecdotally, it's maybe a bit too early for really solid data on this. These labor shortages are very much back in the region as well. So this is another then big challenge for the growth model. The fourth part of the presentation then is to try to bring that all together and do this in a study, in a SWOT analysis, to try and combine and summarize, where are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats for the region in all of this. So the strengths are, at least until this point, economic convergence and stability. As Michael said, I spend a lot of time looking at Southeast Europe. I mean, look from that perspective, this is a success story, this region, in terms of convergence, in terms of social and political stability. The sophisticated export sector is a strength. Some comparative functional specialization, comparative advantages, not enough, but there are some. Progress on the green transition, the quality of the workforce, and then, as I already spoke about, the digital economy, the progress there. In terms of weaknesses, the demographics is a huge one, pretty much for all countries of the region. The over-specialization in production, slow adaptation to structural change in the automotive sector, low levels of R&D, long way to go on the green transition. So in terms of the level, there's a problem with the green transition. And then in some countries, certainly not all, but in some countries, challenges with the digital transition and in terms of education systems. The opportunities in this then are more innovation-led growth is certainly a major opportunity for the region. Nearshoring as a result of the pandemic, more FDI in parts of the economy which have maybe had less so far, so in some parts of the services sector. The digital revolution, which gets a push from the pandemic. The green transition is also an opportunity for the region. And then automation, which I haven't spoken about so far in the presentation, but automation as a solution, at least in some ways, to the labor shortages that the region is facing. Finally, the threats are, well, maybe first and foremost, the trap or the potential trap of functional specialization, the reliance on low labor costs, which the region needs to get away from, the structural change in the automotive sector and the slow adaptation to that. Inequality, which is not necessarily a major theme or hasn't been for the region in the past or in the last decade or two, but one of the things we know from digital-led growth is that it can produce pretty high rates of inequality. So if this continues to be a more important growth driver going forward, this is something that will become probably more of an issue. And then finally, the societal lock-in on fossil fuels. So not accepting the green transition, accepting really the inevitability of it, but really the political opposition to that. The final section, and then I will finish. And as I said, I'm really much more interested in what you all have to say, is the policy proposals. And again, in the report, there's a big section on this. I obviously cannot say everything. I just tried to emphasize the 6 main points that came out of it. So the first is, this is a big transition for the region, and it has to use the fiscal and the monetary policy space that's available to manage that. So not to repeat the mistakes of 2008, and work to change the debate and create more space at the EU level. We have to say, I mean, we completed this study almost a year ago now. It does seem that this first point really is happening so far. The second point is to expand activity beyond production and to really move from imitation to innovation. Partly that means using industrial policy, supporting research and development, which is not great in a lot of the region, helping to develop the links, even if the ideal of the entrepreneurial state is not realistic for these countries, develop the links between government ministries, universities, private sector, social partners, and to maximize all resources from the EU. There are a lot of resources available at the EU level to finance this transition. The third is to direct resources to new sectors, and especially the digital sector, which is really an opportunity from the region. Learn from the front runners, take advantage of the strong human capital that the region at least partly has in this area, help SMEs, and also support the labor market transition. So this, like in many other parts of the economy, it's going to be a huge transition in the labor market, this digital change. Some people in the countries are prepared for it, many will not be, and so the retraining part is going to be very important in this. Fourth is to see the green transition as an opportunity. It is coming, it needs to be accepted, the inevitability of it, and to use the resources, again, a lot of the resources at the EU level that are available for this. Improve innovation capacity in this area, avoid the potential trap of green factory economies, a section in the report by our colleague Nico on that, and also to look for leapfrogging opportunities. So one thing Nico really emphasized in his section was in this area, unlike in a lot of other areas, there isn't such a big gap between Western and Eastern Europe, actually, at least between lots of countries. So there's more opportunity for catch-up and even leapfrogging here than maybe in some other parts of the economy. The fifth policy point is to support automation as a solution to the demographic challenges. It cannot solve them all, but it can certainly help. We suggest, for example, targeting a higher minimum wage as a share of the medium wage to push the automation of low wage, low productivity jobs, ease the transition to new jobs. Education system is important here. Active labor market policies are very important. And again, the retraining element will be very significant here to manage this transition. And then the final point, and this is something we had a little bit of a section as well, just thinking about how this all went in the 90s in the last transition, is to acknowledge there's going to be a huge social fallout. There is already from this transition. This is a second transition for the region, and we need to make sure that the welfare system bears the costs of this, more progressive income tax to fund this, and also think about the urban-rural disparities, which in things like the digital transition are going to be already are very significant. So that was it. This is the project team, by the way. I cannot mention everybody, but I just wanted to acknowledge it was a very big team that worked on this, and I'm presenting on behalf of this big team. And thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Richard, for a well-structured presentation. I should mention before we start a response, I think some of you already made use of the Q&A section. So don't put it into the chat, but into the Q&A section, whatever questions you have. I would also be very grateful if your comments are not too long, because I have to moderate the discussion and read your comments at the same time. Some of them are extremely long, so try to be to the point. There was a short question, which I think I can directly put to Richard already, which is, why is there such a big difference in this labor supply, labor demand crossover between post and pre-COVID, that situation? Can you just reply to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's from Marcus Eller, I think. So thanks for the question. Yeah, it's an important question. We were doing this, the timing of the study was quite difficult. It was commissioned in February of last year when I was in Berlin, which was my last foreign, it was kind of one of the last foreign trip before the pandemic. And so it was a study commissioned pre-pandemic, but then done during the pandemic. And we updated a lot of the calculations, including this one, right in the depths of the pandemic. So that included European Commission growth forecasts, which were way more negative, and European Commission unemployment forecasts, which were way more negative than they are today. So that's why I tried to mention that briefly in the presentation. I mean, there was a huge difference between the gray bars and the orange bars, pre and post pandemic. But if we updated it now, those orange bars, I think, would be a lot smaller. We'd be a lot closer back to the gray bars, maybe not back to that point, but a lot more. So actually it reflects really a very particular time when the study was done. And I think, like I say, if we did it now, that would not be the case.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So let's get our responses, 5 minutes each, starting with Deborah.
Yes, Hello, and I'm really happy to be part of this panel. And I apologize ex ante because I seem to have a very unstable line. So please alert me if you are losing me, and I will try to switch off the video. So it's really a pleasure to be one of the discussed excellent study that really touch the most important challenge of the region. And I think it's very close to actually work that we have been doing at the European Investment Bank that was actually exactly try to understand this question, whether we are close to hitting the maximum that we can get from the old growth model of the region and what has to change. So we were coming to very similar conclusion, and I think it's important to that we come that we have a strong assessment of what are the needs. Also because we have to develop a policy response, and then having a strong similar studies is a good point to start. So what we were looking at actually
there are quite a few interruptions of your transmission now.
Deborah, maybe you switch
Europe,
off the
of regions in Central Eastern Europe versus the one. Okay. Can you hear me better now? Hello?
Yes, please carry on.
That's better, yeah.
Okay. Sorry for this. One of the points, actually looking at the European level and looking at the last 20 years, if you look at the convergence path within Europe, what you see that actually the convergence path is determined by countries in Central Eastern Europe, while countries in South Europe have been stalling in the convergence. So actually the convergence story of the last year in Europe is really done by Central Eastern Europe, which is converging. In Central Eastern Europe, convergence is also very much a matter of location and geographical location. We know the massive convergence of capitals and the divergence between regions in Central Eastern Europe in the various countries that still remain. So this is something important because the story of convergence is also a story of intra-countries divergence that need policy action to be considered. But then when we look at the overall transformation of the growth model, one of the key elements, I think it's related to homegrown innovation. And this is something quite important for the region and something that is well reflected also in the studies, and that was important also in what we have been looking at. On the homegrown innovation, we all know that the region has been very much started the innovation path, mostly by adopting innovation, having a little of the homegrown innovation, more incremental innovation coming out from the region. But it's not only that, partly is also because even at the national level, there is not much more investment on intangible, except in a few countries. But in general, I think is the whole of the innovation framework of the region that is very much dependent on this internalizing innovation developed elsewhere, or trying to have incremental innovation rather than radical innovation. But the situation is changing, and that's a part of the very good story, that you have some innovation hubs that are kind of emerging. So you see some in the Baltics, definitely in the Balkans, and you start seeing it more, some small hubs around the region. The concern is related to the finance side and to the capacity of the of the economy to integrate and use this homegrown innovation, even when it's a disruptive innovation. On the finance part, I think in the region we continue, even in this moment, it's a concern for almost double the share of firms than in Europe. We are talking in general of a low level of finance constraint in this phase of the cycle, but in the region is much higher. And also the finance is very much bank related, is not innovation finance related. And there is really a gap in the market that needs to be addressed. I think at the policy level, there is a lot that is of policy support. We are also involved as an institution to try to back venture capital, private equity funds to operate more in the region and support the development of this kind of finance. And another element is the venture debt. That is a peculiar form of debt, very suitable for fast growing firms that has much of the features that are needed to support innovation. So these are the finance part and the bank-based finance in the region. The lack of the more innovative finance is part of the concern for the homegrown innovation. The region has somehow answered with a very strong focus on if you want industrial policies, but also innovation policies. So try to launch super innovation in some areas. I think when we talk about innovation, it's very difficult to have this policy well developed. I think it's much better to have an operating environment that also to be linked and integrate into economic development for the country. So that's the first point. Other 2 points that I would like to make at this moment. One is related to digitalization, and I think on digitalization, as was also presented in the studies, the region is not too badly positioned. Actually, particularly on the skills part, there is some potential in terms of development, and we know that skills are one of the major impediments for digitalization all over Europe, and not only in Central Eastern Europe. But the challenge is to keep the skills in the region. So how to make sure that these skills that are scarce at the European level, they actually contribute also to the digital transformation in the region and for advancing on this point of view. And the last point, and I think this digital and skill nexus is quite important. I will come back with other points later related to the green transition and the challenge, but also the opportunity that it brings for the region. But just to conclude, I would really like to point the accent on the fact that the region has performed very well so far. The policy may have to shift in order to accompany the next phase of the transformation. And I think here the operating environment is also very important, because what you need more is a solid environment supporting to innovation and transformation. And that's where policies and business have to come together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah. You covered a lot of things. Some things which are probably less covered in the report, which like the intra-country regional differentiation. Of course, there are many studies on that, but I think it's a very important thing in this structural transformation. You spoke a bit in more detail on the innovation framework, and I think we will come back to that when we speak about a particular form which industrial policy might take in Eastern Europe. And you also point to the importance of stability in the policy environment, apart from financing instruments. And I think an area which I think Richard touched upon at the end was the possibility or the fear of these massive structural changes, which are probably which are going to take place, in addition to the ones which have already taken place, which could lead to social polarization and might also have some feedback effect on the policy framework. So let me move on to Jan. What is your reaction to the report?
So, I mean, it might come as a surprise, but to some extent, I agree with the report. I will talk about the solutions proposed by the report maybe a little bit later. Some of them now, but some of them later. But I mean, yes, I mean, of course, CEEs are the factory Europe. I mean, and yes, of course, the cost competitiveness is the major driving factor, and it surely curbs the wage growth. And in fact, when you try to see how big this cost advantage is by taking into account the unit labor cost or the productivity adjusted wage differences, this margin is actually quite low because it's around 10%. For Poland, at least. It might be different for other countries, where on the top of my head, I only have the Polish data right now. And there has been a little bit of a deterioration of that over the last 10 years, if we will look at 2019. But in fact, I mean, if you look at 2020, suddenly, due to the different changes in the EU-CEE, in fact, this sort of difference has even widened. So improved in terms of cost competitiveness, which might be, at least for countries that have flexible exchange rate, it might be also due to the fact that some of the currencies depreciated, at least the Polish one did. But then, I mean, if you take a look at this functional specialization that you analyze in the papers, of course, I mean, this is a very nice way of presenting this. Congratulated for the analysis, but that's not something that we didn't know, right? I mean, that's something that we knew for some time. That when you take a look at where the FDI is located mainly in production, but no wonder that it happens like this, because I mean, to do both the headquarters services and to do R&D, you really need a lot of labor market pooling. You need the economics of scope and so on, which are not present in the countries that we're talking about, because they never developed this. And that's a little bit like a hollow circle in a way. I mean, you don't have headquarters services and R&D because you didn't have them before. So there is no point locating them here, because it's not going to work anyway. I mean, the entry costs are just larger because you don't have the required resources, so there is no absorptive capacity for this sort of FDI. So of course now the question is how to build it, and the answer is I don't know. I mean, that's a little bit difficult to think what you could do. And I'm not an expert in economic history, but what you propose is a model of reform where you actually put a lot of more states into the CECs, and maybe this idea is not wrong. I mean, it has worked in the Scandinavian countries a long time ago, and also some sort of an infant industry protection as well, which has, did not work. It has not worked so well in the past. And also, I mean, if we consider the examples of other countries around the world that has tried to isolate themselves from the world and improve their competitiveness and improve their innovativeness, well, that's not possible now because you cannot isolate. So you work in this sort of environment where you actually are in a very integrated world. So it's kind of difficult to go ahead and think about a model where you in isolation try to introduce this sort of reform where you try to support some sectors that need to in general develop from scratch. So of course the question is what sectors, and this, I mean, there is some talk in the report about the pharmaceuticals, but I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is a little bit different than all other industries, because actually there is R&D that goes around the world, but then in terms of patents, it's used everywhere. So I mean, it's still production. But it's production of a highly R&D intensive. There is not so much R&D going in the pharmaceuticals in the Central and Eastern Europe. And second, when you take a look at pharmaceuticals, there was actually quite a lot of some borderline illegal things going on with the pharmaceuticals being produced in the Central and Eastern Europe, but then being exported to the rest of Europe because of the cost differences. And these cost differences were rather not the differences that stemmed from the actual competitiveness of the companies, but rather because of some policy differences, in particular tax differences. So I believe that the pharmaceutical industry example is not the best one, but there have been some sectors that are actually quite well developing, and they are, so to say, big players in the global levels, and that's the gaming industry, for example, which requires not so large setup costs. And also doesn't require a lot of capital, which the CE countries do not have. And it is actually quite booming. And it is booming in terms of the large companies and also in terms of multiple SMEs, startups, and so on and so on. So in this case, I mean, I think that I mean, if we want to consider even the innovativeness, then of course I think the future is in the services. But of course, there's a question: who is going to produce everything in Europe, right? I mean, in terms of the consumption goods. I mean, of course, will be a structural change, which you also see in the change in the production of cars and so on. But this change is not going to, to eradicate all the consumption goods production and investment goods production and intermediate goods production. And there is one more thing that I wanted to talk about. And also, I mean, the countries across the regions are very diversified. In fact, you have large countries like Poland, you have small countries like Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, highly specialized countries and non-specialized countries. You've got Estonia, which is an outlier in every way. But once again, it's easy to be Estonia because it's a country of 2 cities and nothing else, basically, and it's small and it's very modern, right? So, so that's, I mean, there is not so much things that we can, I mean, you could say that, take the Estonian example. Yes, you can take the Estonian example. For example, you can take the way how they approach digitization, how they approach e-government and so on, of course, yes. But you cannot apply all the Estonian example to all the countries across the region. And just to 2 more points, very short. So one of your solutions is this increase in the minimum wage. I mean, what I agreed, I completely agree that. I mean, even though I come from a sort of a liberal think tank, but maybe I'm, on the left side of this think tank, in fact. I agree that we need more redistribution in terms of both in terms of regions in the countries in the CEE, but also in terms of the taxpayers and population. But I mean, if you think about the increase in the minimum wage, which are anyway planned in the CECs, at least in Poland, there is actually a plan to substantially increase the minimum wage. You could think of 2 scenarios how this might end up. One scenario is that they go along your scenario, which is okay. Now it's really not so profitable to employ labor in basic tasks anymore, so we switch to automatization. But then, if you are a foreign investor and you have a plethora of different production facilities across the world, and you can see one of your countries increasing the minimum wage, you might think, okay, so why do I care about this country? Why do I need to produce there anymore? I mean, if I automatize, I can automatize in another country where, for example, the institutional situation is more comfortable.
Okay, Jan, you can
Yeah,
come to an end.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you.
So yeah, so of course,
thank you.
Yeah, I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, you pointed to quite a few difficulties to move from an entrenched industrial structure and change specialization structures, and also change the position of countries within a certain wage hierarchy within the European context. Maruska, your turn.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the Institute and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for allowing us to learn so much from this wonderful study. I would, a lot of things were already said by my colleagues, so I think I can maybe keep it brief and just so that we are on time. A couple of points. So the main challenge here is, as we have seen it, is how to find the most appropriate transition from the production-led growth model to a more service-driven growth model. But by services, we mean services with higher value added. And to move to that kind of growth model, I think we can all agree we need higher quality, the quality of institutions and the more effective institutions in the region, and of course the quality of human capital. In the study, we have a very brief mention of the quality of the institutions, or of the, especially in terms of the recent trends in the region that suggest that the quality of institution, especially in terms of democratization and the independent judiciary and similar, is actually reversing. So it's going the opposite way from the way it would be required in order to have a really higher value-added service-driven economy. So far, this hasn't really produced any kind of adverse effect. But if these trends persist, and they may persist with this immigration trends, where we have a higher skilled labor moving out of the region into Western European countries, then more populism means even less efficient institutions. The second precondition for service-led growth is, of course, the quality of human capital. Here again, this I would call it a locked position in terms of locked functional complementarities between Western Europe and especially Germany and Central and Eastern European countries really makes a lot of problems, because what we are seeing is a higher skilled labor moving to serve to be employed in Western European countries in those headquarter functions, and thus amplifying the problem that we see at hand of these economies, or at least some of these economies being turned into a production floor. So for me, the main question, to which I don't really have an answer, I have a lot of questions, is how to move away from these dual functional complementarities, or how these economies can move away from these locked functional complementarities, because as we see in the study, these complementarities only got worse over time. They didn't got better for at least for the Visegrad countries and Romania. So what would be the key? Because remain as having, and I would like to emphasize here that it's not just Eastern European countries are not a specific case here. If you look at the studies of the way how the global value chains change over time, we see that they are more sourced in Germany and in China over time. So this is the global pattern, and the region is just a part of it, even though a very pronounced part of it. So one way out of it would be to develop other global value chains, or to include more of these economies into Asian and US value chains, and that kind of way move from this dependence on Western Europe. Even it doesn't really seem real, but it's something that Korea did. Again, here things are different, but just staying locked in this position doesn't really, I don't think it offers a lot of potential for moving to service-based growth. The other thing would be to create what was being called national champions, or I would call it to create global brands. So whether these economies have the potential to create really global brands that would then allow them the control over the value chain. That's an issue. And in the study, we see that the emphasis on national innovation systems and learning from the successful examples. And the region indeed has quite a few of successful examples in terms of unicorns, for example. So I think more work needs to be done there, because I think eventually, if this region wants to really get to an income level of the Western Europe, they are going to have their own global brands. What else they wanted? The last point, and maybe the most important one, it's the demographics. So to put things in a little bit more of a perspective, when you look at the demographic prospects for the half and for the end of this century, Eastern Europe is the region that is facing the worst demographic decline in the world. That puts a huge challenge. I mean, the study suggests automation can help alleviate the problem, and I do agree it can help, but I don't think it will help completely. And even, I mean, in the study, it was written in one sentence that the economies in the region have to deal with it. But dealing with the labor shortages and dealing with the constraints on the labor force just means lower potential output. And then that stalls the convergence process and keeps those economies where they are now, either the lower or upper middle income countries. So in that kind of respect, we cannot really, we know that turning the demographic trends around, it's not something that you can do overnight or even over one political cycle. But I think the most important challenge for the region in terms of the long run, in terms of convergence, is the demographic challenge, and it's automation may help, can help, but it definitely won't solve the problem. So that's for starters. Thank you.
Thank you, Maruska. Richard, I just wondered whether you want to pick up 2 or 3 points, not everything which has been said, but you might want to rake to a few points.
Yeah, I can. Thanks, Michael. So thank you very much for these comments. It was extremely interesting to listen to them. I have to say, I agree with a lot of what was said. Yeah, if I just pick up a couple, I think Maruska really, as you often do, kind of hit the nail on the head, or highlighted, I think, the most important thing with your first comment about institutions. I mean, if I was reading this report rather than presenting it, I think that would also be my first question. I mean, we have, I think, a fairly ambitious, and we want it to be ambitious, you know, in terms of the policy, what to do about this. We believe the region is capable of achieving a much higher level of convergence. I mean, it should be ambitious, but to enact policies, a lot of these policies, you do need good institutions. And we know that at least in some countries in the region, that's not the case at the moment. And in at least a couple, it's going in the wrong direction, as you said, Maruska. So, I mean, I think that is the big question. And if anybody wants to finance a follow-up study, I mean, I think that would be a big part, that should be a big part of the focus of what's next. I mean, I would say, again, being someone who looks at a lot of countries outside the EU, I do think that there's a lot more hope still for institutional upgrading because of the EU membership. I think it's a very important strength of this these countries, which I don't think we've mentioned at all yet, actually, but I think it's very important to keep that in mind. So I think that, and we're at a very important point in all of that, as we know, as we see what's going on in Poland at the moment. I mean, we're at a very important point where we see, what can the EU do in terms of stopping deterioration, let's say, in institutions and forcing positive change in institutions. So I agree with the criticism. That's, I think, a very fair point. A couple of other things. I mean, maybe one thing Deborah said, one thing Jan said. So Deborah, I think, mentioned about, okay, there are good skills, digital skills, but how to keep them in the region. And I think the pandemic, in a way, gives the opportunity for that. I mean, if I may do a bit of publicity for a study Michael did with our colleague Sandra on the Western Balkans, we actually see recently in some countries brain gains. So younger educated people actually on a net basis moving back to the region. And I think you can certainly see a scenario where that would increase after the pandemic, with remote working, everything being online. The importance of, being in Germany or the Netherlands is maybe not what it was before this pandemic. So I think the digital revolution that we're seeing actually creates an opportunity which wasn't there before to keep more of the highly skilled people in the region. Just to touch then finally on something Jan said, or to link a couple of things that Jan said. I mean, you asked who will produce the goods. I mean, I think we see that already, that production is being moved further east and south as wages rise in these countries. I mean, it's not happening dramatically quickly, but we see certainly more FDI going to Serbia, Romania, Turkey. So, I mean, it's already happening in a way. I don't think that we can stop that. And okay, maybe the minimum wage itself is a very blunt instrument, but there is a fair literature now on this, that wage rises can be a leader of productivity increases. And I think that's something that certainly in countries of the region where the minimum wage is very low compared to the median wage, which is lots of the region, that's a policy that needs to be thought about. And I don't think FDI will leave necessarily, not on a massive scale. There are plenty of other reasons why firms are in these countries, not only for low labor costs. So I wouldn't be so pessimistic, let's say, about that. So those are my initial reactions.
So thank you very much. I think we are probably going to run out of time. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to make only 2 rounds amongst the panelists. One is to be a bit more specific of what we mean by industrial and innovation policy. I think probably a question particularly directed towards Deborah, but also other people might want to chip in. Jan, there were quite a few comments also on the difficulties to change GVCs in a sense that they are decided by incumbent big headquarter firms. So I think you might want to address that. You have partly addressed it also. Also, there is this issue that these countries very successfully had a reindustrialization process. So their comparative advantage now are settled in the area of manufacturing. And of course, probably also something to Richard later on to refer back to it. It's the issue of specialization is an issue of comparative advantage. So if these countries move away from production, where does production move to? And why should other countries which have a comparative advantage in pre and post production tasks, in R&D and post production functional tasks, why would they give it up? There's a sort of naturally ingrained comparative advantage structure. There's also a question probably which either Maruska or Jan might want to address in relation to GVCs is the issue of nearshoring. To which extent do you feel it's going to make a difference? So that's my first round, questions to different people. The second round will be more on what EU policy should do in relation to the, if it's not all set up already, in relation to the region, and vice versa, to which extent does the region should react and participate or even change the direction in which EU policy is being formed at the cross-European level. So let me start with the first round on industrial innovation policy, on the issue of changing GVC, to which extent functional specialization can be changed, nearshoring, etc. And probably also, if somebody wants to touch upon that, structural change means dramatic shifts of occupations, drawing on the skills of different age structures or different education groups. So there's a huge social structural adaptation process going on, which potentially might conflict with the idea of modernization and upgrading, because there might be sections of the population which are falling behind, which in turn will have policy, generates policy reactions. So I think this will be a hugely important issue, as it was already over the last 10, 15 years, as we have seen in the political reactions to dramatic structural changes which were taking place. So Deborah, let me start with you on being a bit more specific on how industrial innovation policy should look like in the different CECs.
I think it's a very complex topic to talk about industrial innovation policies, and I think as an economist, I always have the concern on saying how much the public sector can really guide the transformation of sectorial dynamics with incentive and public incentives. And here, I think there is a rule for the public sector in this direction, but I think it has to be a rule in which the incentives are set for the private sector to develop its own strategy, so that it sees the business of the private sector, but the rule of the government should not be too much a guiding element. That's maybe a personal view, maybe a way in which I tend to think at the complementarity rule between a private and public sector. But still, there is a lot that can be done in this direction, and I think one of the elements that I always think is quite important is related to the infrastructure development. We are talking about issues related to, we are talking about the effect also of transformation, digitalization, etc. This very much depends also on the infrastructure that you have behind and on public investment that is happening. If you think about the climate transition, there is as well a lot of thinking and creating the regulatory framework, creating the right certainty in terms of policies and direction. And that's the role of the public sector as well coming. Part of our studies, I make a small deviation on this specific topic, but part of the studies that we are doing, we are looking at firms' awareness of physical and transition risk and what constrains firms' investment to deal with the climate change related risk, again, physical and transition risk. One of the main impediments that the firms encounter is in terms of certainty about regulation and taxation. So the lack of clarity in terms of a firm direction in the green transition is the major impediment for firms to invest and operate. So this is a clear case in which the public sector has a strong role, but the strong role is in giving the direction, the very strong commitment for movement going forward. And then when this is done, the private sector should try to, should then kick in and try to transform, but with clear guidance in terms of the policy direction. This is one case. And then another case, I was mentioning the issue of infrastructure, and I think this is equally important, and we see the relevance in two cases, and I wanted to make two simple examples. One, I was talking about digitalization. We are looking, and that's at the European level of overall, how much firms are advancing in digitalization following the COVID crisis. And you see that the firms that have been located in an area where the broadband connection is very good are much more likely to advance digitalization as a response to COVID. So the presence of infrastructure is a clear determinant of firms' decisions to then transform. And again, I think here you see the complementarity public-private sector. In this case, the public sector bringing the network, and the private sector more and more reacting and advancing in a transformation process. Another example that I see that is important and actually is very crucial in this phase of the transformation, I go back to the issue in terms of skills. I think there are two issues to consider, and I very much agree that the post-COVID is an opportunity. A lot of people have been going back to the region. The problem here is now how to offer them an environment in which they decide to stay. And then you have various elements for that. You have the environment that should be an attractive environment for people with skills that they decide to come back. You need to have a work environment that is flexible to integrate people that come with a different expertise, higher expertise in curriculum. You have to be able to reintegrate them into the job market at the right level and with the right responsibility for the transformation that they have to develop. And always on the skills one, another element I wanted to bring, actually, there is one area where the region is quite poor, and that's in terms of private sector training. There is a very little private training that is happening at the firm level, and very little incentive happening in that direction. And that's something that I think would be important. And I stop here and I leave to others.
Thank you very much. Just to the audience, the way I framed my questions to the panelists was also trying to bring in some of your extensive comments. So don't think that I'm not aware of what you put into the question and answer section, but I'm trying to group them in a way. So Jan, probably your views on policy GVCs, etc.
So maybe I'll start with the reshoring to change the subject a little bit, and then I will go back to the innovation. So I'll be short with the reshoring. So I think that, I mean, if we just kept the status quo, there shouldn't be any reshoring, because I mean the advantages from the GVCs, from the headquarters, so to say, are still so big that even with this, hopefully temporary disruptions in trade, you would not. I mean, it would not be viable to actually reshore, because if you count the sunk cost of fragmentation that you have borne so far, and also the profits that you got from this, it doesn't seem viable. But then there are certain policy developments apart from the pandemics that are important. Now, that's the European Green Deal and carbon adjustment tax mechanism, which is basically a carbon tariff that's going to be levied, that's going to equate the cost of carbon between the intra-European trade and the extra-European trade. This is to prevent carbon leakage, so that we move our most emitting production to countries where environmental protection is very lax. And therefore, there will be potentially, unless there is a big change in the way the global value chains produce and how they treat environment, there potential will be a way to, there will be a process of reshoring. So there will be more production activities reshored to Europe, which is a bad news and a good news, right? And from a good news point of view, this is still going to keep, keep the old model of growth going for some time, because still it's going to be potentially more profitable to invest in less polluting technology in Europe and to reshore to Europe than to pay this carbon adjustment tax, which is potentially very high. These are compared to the overall level of tariffs, if you take into account the carbon costs, it's potentially a very high tariff to pay on the imports of goods from extra EU. So I think the major case for reshoring is the European Green Deal, in fact. Going back to just a short point on the national innovation systems. So here I'm very skeptical, because there already are national innovation systems. There already are institutions in every CEE countries that are supposed to streamline and support innovation. The problem is that they have been there for more than 10 years in many countries, and nothing has really happened. I mean, there is some innovation, and this is basically, I mean, this is geared mostly at the cooperation between universities and the business, but it's not that there have been, you know, thousands of projects like this. Not really. I mean, this is not going as it was supposed to be going. This is rather a small scale innovation activity that's going on thanks to these projects. But of course, the main problem of this is the political cycle. That the view on the way how these sort of systems can be organized is changing with every change in the power, and that's usually, you know, starting from scratch. What does it mean? Well, it means also that we should probably think about something that's rather European-wide than Europe-wide or EU-wide rather than country-specific. Also because innovation is really a matter of cooperation, and in many areas, in particular in industrial solutions, as we said already, the CEEs are not going to have a comparative advantage no matter what. But they could play a large role in the global value chains driven research that is supported by European institutions. I think that we need to remember one thing, that exporting to Europe, exporting to Western Europe, which is where the more than 80% of the value added generated in the exports of the CECs, it goes to Europe. Very little of those exports go to the rest of the world. And in fact, where the most of the value added is per unit of exports is the exports to the third countries. And this is also where growth is, right? Because you've got these fast-growing developing countries that are big, and they are a big source of demand. So, in my opinion, the way to increase the role of the CECs in the European global value chains is through a European-wide innovation system that would have some sort of quotas that would require the projects to actually include the partners from the CECs. Some sort of a system like that. And moreover, I mean, if you think about, that's the last point, and I'm going to stop. The problem, of course, is that on one hand, innovation needs public support because it needs funding. But second, if you think about public administration, risk is not a part of it. And I mean, this is the last thing that the government officials want, is to deal with any risk, which is, you know, embedded in the process of innovation. And this is one of the reasons why it doesn't work so well, together with the overall bad quality of institutions in the Central and Eastern Europe. Therefore, I'm really skeptical if anything at the country level would be able to work. Thank you.
Maruska, you're welcome to pick and choose. It would be nice if you also spoke about this problem of possible social polarization, which all these structural changes might involve. There are also quite a few questions on the macro framework, which should accompany these structural change policies. Yeah. And I know you're a macroeconomist, you might want to address this as well. Maruska.
I will again be very brief. I just want to touch upon an idea that was shared by Jan. I think that the digitalization in terms of Industry 4.0 that requires transition from mass production to mass customization definitely calls for at least nearshoring, if not reshoring. With the advance of 5G, which is we still don't feel that advance here, but it's going to happen in 10, 15, 20 years. We are going to face another new technological revolution with use cases that we don't even know exist at this moment in time. That Industry 4.0 combined with the policies aiming to address the climate change, in my opinion, will definitely lead to nearshoring or reshoring, especially if we see this pandemic situation getting worse over time and seeing the supply shortages persisting over time. So I think in this, and I agree with Jan, this is not really, it's kind of a mixed news for the region, because this again focuses the region more on production, and the region is trying to get away from that. But then again, there are differences between the regions. So if that production can focus in, let's say, Croatia or Baltic countries or Bulgaria that are not so strong in production, that's not such a bad news. So that would be one point. Here, digital infrastructure, digital skills, of course, are paramount, but digital infrastructure is even more important. And we know from all of the indicators that we have a couple of countries that are looking really not well in terms of the state of their digital infrastructure. And here, who gets to update the infrastructure first is going to be the prime location for this nearshoring if it happens. Also, one has to take into consideration that even if you look at the present studies that assess the impact of 5G on industries across Europe, you will see that the benefit to cost ratio of adopting 5G in industry is like 2 to 3 times larger in Western Europe than in Eastern Europe, even in Czech Republic or in Slovenia. So in that sense, there is a bit of a threat there that with the advance of Industry 4G, this comparative advantage that is now here is going to not disappear, but not be as strong as before. With regarding to national policies, as you know that right in this moment, the European Council and Commission are debating extensively how to change the fiscal framework and the macroeconomic governance, but especially fiscal framework that is now suspended, but we expect fiscal rules to be back into operation, but new fiscal rules in 2023. In that sense, I hear I think we have a problem in terms of that the region itself is not really on the same page. So we have the countries that are part of the Hanseatic League that still push for stringent fiscal frameworks, and then you have countries that are not, that prefer probably a lax fiscal situation. But the way this new fiscal framework is going to be designed, probably it's going to allow for fiscal spending on climate change, on energy transition and things like that. The way that framework is going to be designed is going to condition how these economies are going to, if the state is going to be more important in the future, that fiscal framework is going to condition how exactly the state will support the private sector in producing the new innovative economies. Again, as Jan, I'm not really that confident that that it's going to produce much from these studies that from the case studies that we have in terms of really successful unicorns in the region. I think it was much more good luck than good policy, but it doesn't, maybe things can change, but.
Thank you, Maruska. Well, we are running out of time, so I'll just want to give 2 minutes to Deborah still. Deborah, the EIB was heavily involved in the law investment plan, and I'm sure you are also involved in recovery and resilience, and also in just-in-time framework. If you were to suggest in which direction EU policy are supposed to get a new slant, which is not there already, which has not been conceived in all these debates and setting up of institutions and financial instruments, which cater to the needs of the, let's say, medium income and lower income countries of Europe, Central Eastern Europe, of course, the prime one, which slant of the direction in which EU policy is evolving would you suggest? Deborah.
Yeah. So I think you are mentioning the recovery and resilience facility, and I think for Central Eastern Europe, so for the EU member states, it's essential to use these resources well and to have them effectively having the impact that they can have on the economy. But that means I think the lesson that we learn from the previous the FC or the Juncker plan, as it was called at the time, is very much that implementation is crucial. And implementation requires not only now what we have seen is the design of the program that has been designed, not yet by all countries, and not yet approved by all countries, as we all well know in Central Eastern Europe. But for the countries that are going in the direction, we have design plans and we also have anticipation of some of the money. But from now on, execution will be crucial. And without execution, you will not have, without proof that the various measures that you had put in the plan, that they are really executed, you will not get the resources going forward. So I think this is a huge challenge for some of the countries that really will have to have the implementation of these programs step by step in the next year. And that is extremely important because the resources are very much going to support the digitalization on the one side, but particularly the green transition. And there are a lot of resources on the plate in this moment. And to me, it's really this issue of implementation and capacity to deal it with is extremely important. For the countries extra EU in this moment, so this is valid for the EU member state. For the other countries, there is not such a program at the moment in place, but I think the philosophy of having a strong focus on investment that goes to support the green and digital transition, somehow we have to come out with something. Institutions like the EIB, the EBRD can play a role in this direction, but I think they have to come with integrated plans with a clear direction, both for the digital and the green transition.
Thank you, Deborah. The last few minutes, I pass on to Richard. I think just pick where you want to make some final statements. You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm muted. I'll try to. It seems to me the tone of our debate has been quite despondent, actually, or quite negative on a lot of things. That it's very difficult and not much will change and not such a great future. I mean, I would like to try to bring back at the end a bit of more positivity. So, I mean, maybe because I spend a lot of my life thinking about Russia and Turkey and Serbia and countries like that, I think the role of the EU in this all is extremely central. And it is a major advantage for these countries still to be members of the EU, even if there are certain constraints that come with that. And Deborah actually mentioned, I think, both of them just now very well. So one is just the resources, you know. everybody's facing these transitions. You know, all the other countries that are not in the EU are all facing these transitions, but these countries have huge resources available at the EU level. The existing budget, Next Generation EU, the Just Transition Fund within that. I mean, this is a major opportunity to be used to manage this transition. That's the first thing. And the second thing on the institutions, I mean, EU membership, it doesn't guarantee anything, but it creates a much greater likelihood of institutional upgrading than any other feasible scenario outside of the EU for this region. In terms of the innovation and whether it comes from the national level, whether it comes from the EU level. So I accept the point, of course, there's also a very big role for the EU here, but these are very different types of countries. You know, I do not, we're talking here about the growth model, but if we compare the Estonian growth model to the Slovak growth model, to the Croatian growth model, these are very, very different kinds of growth models really as well. They're very different. There are some very particular national characteristics to that. And so even if it's difficult and even if it didn't work out so well so far, I think we have to keep putting the emphasis also on partly national solutions, that in the end, it's people at the national level who to a large extent know what is required for this. So I don't rule out, I don't want to minimize the role of the EU in this, but I think also the national level is also part of the solution. So those are my final remarks, and I try to, a bit more positivity, I think, from my side.
Thank you very much. Obviously, they were quite successful in many ways in the past, and they are now a new bout of structural challenges, which these countries have been facing from the very beginning of transition, actually. And it's probably another positive element might be that they are used to structural change. Yeah, probably the population there might be more adaptable than we find in many advanced economies. On the other hand, we also see quite strong political reactions to the possible pressures and tensions which these structural changes are imposing. So I have to apologize to the very diligent question and answer contributors. I tried to bring in some form some of the questions, but not in all detail. It was impossible given the time we had. This webinar will also be on Tube at some point from our website, I guess, Richard, in a few days' time. We will have a version. So if you want to rewatch or you want to point some of your colleagues or friends to this webinar, please do so. You will find it on our website. Let me thank the panelists very much for contributing to the discussion and taking it very seriously, also looking at the report. And Richard for coordinating the report and the session, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for helping us to embark on this rather interesting research. We'll continue to work on it. So all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you also from my side, and for the excellent contributions from the panelists. It was really very interesting.